Mark Woods is the author of Lassoing the Sun, A Year in America's National Parks. He has been Metro columnist at the Florida Times Union in Jacksonville since 2003. And before that, he spent 20 years as a sports writer at newspapers in Florida, Kentucky, Missouri, and Indiana. He covered the earthquake in Haiti, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, political conventions, the Olympics, Wimbledon, the Masters, the World Cup, and 11 Super Bowls. But he says none of those assignments compared to what he did in 2012, the year that led to Lassoing the Sun, supported by the Eugene C. Pulliam Fellowship, awarded to him by the Society of Professional Journalists. Mark will be joined in conversation with Barbara Goodman. Barbara is an international park consultant and co-founder of the Riverfront Parks Conservancy. Barbara retired from the National Park Service in 2015 after 33 years of service, and most recently as a superintendent of the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve for 18 years. During this time, she provided the leadership and vision for the development of unprecedented trilateral agreement between the National Park Service, the Florida Park Service, and the City of Jacksonville Preservation Parks to create a seamless system of parks and to cooperate in planning, promotion, and resource protection. Barbara currently provides consultation assistance and guidance to directors of national park systems internationally and in the areas of park planning and tourism in association with Global Parks and the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. So Barbara, I'll leave the rest to you.
All right, thank you. Well, it's great to see the room has filled up, and welcome to all of you. We're really happy that you're here. And Mark and I love to talk about parks, and so we'll just get started. Send your cards in if you have any questions, and we'll get to them towards the end. So, hey, Mark.
Hi. First of all, yeah, thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to the library, and thanks to Barbara. When I had this fellowship year, she was one of the first people I contacted because she was working at the time as the superintendent of Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve, our local national park. So she was a great resource from the get-go to pick her brain. So we're lucky to have her in our community in that role, but also now trying to work on our riverfront. So
yeah.
Thank you for doing this. So I wanted to start out by saying that.
Well, thank you. Well, so I loved your book. It resonated for me through the whole thing. It's about parks, which of course is my life. So that part for sure. But then also you shared your emotional experience with the loss of your mother. I lost my mother, well, it's over 40 years now, but it still is, of course, something that you can bring back up immediately. So it just, both aspects of your book were really meaningful. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's talk about the fellowship and how the whole thing started.
Yeah, so I guess for those of you who don't know, I'm a columnist at the Florida Times Union, have been since 2001. And I guess it was about, but I had been in journalism since, I guess, 1983. But in 2011, this email popped into my inbox from the Society of Professional Journalists about Eugene C. Pulliam Fellowship. And I know I deleted it once, at least, I think probably 2 or 3 times before. It was one of those things, you get so many emails, and I finally looked at it and said, oh, this is this award they basically give to one person a year. And, that basically kind of gives a journalist a sabbatical year to pursue their kind of dream assignment. And when I looked, it said it was for one mid-career journalist. I thought, well, hopefully I'm mid-career. I'm not losing my job soon. And I've been doing this for a while. And, but then I thought, oh, what would I do this on? And I looked at some of the previous winners, and they were very meaty subjects. I mean, they were basically things that were in the news then and still are now. Kind of, you think of, war or gun violence or poverty or, education, basically all these big, heavy issues. And I thought, I don't know that I really want to spend a year immersed in any of these. If I had a year off to pursue something, it'd be, I don't know, travel to national parks, but they'll never give me a fellowship for that. But then I started to think about it and kind of thought, this was not long after Ken Burns' documentary came out. So I think I owe a big gratitude to him for kind of putting the parks on everybody's radar again in a way that they maybe hadn't been. And then the National Park Service Centennial was coming up in 2016. So I sat down, I think the deadline was like on a Monday for the submit an entry, and I sat down on like Sunday and spent all day and wrote like 20-page proposal. I tend to procrastinate and shipped it off the next day. But in a nutshell, it was basically that Ken Burns and Ansel Adams and all these other people, John Muir, had wonderfully and beautifully documented the history of the national parks, but what was the future of the national parks? So I shipped it off and didn't think much about it for a few months. And then I got a voicemail on my phone one day. I can still picture getting this, and it was the head of the judging committee. I thought, well, this is maybe good. Maybe I'm in the running and they have some questions. So I called him back, and that's when he said, well, you won, you're our fellowship winner next year. Your project proposal won. So that's when I went to see Barbara. What do I do now? So I instantly had people saying, do you need somebody to carry your bags with you this year? Do you need, and then the other thing I'd hear was, you have to go to such and such a national park. They'd tell me everybody has their favorite. How many people in here have been to a national park? Wow. Almost everybody, and somebody with 46. Kind of said you have to go to such and such a park. And I'd explain my goal wasn't to make it to, at that point, I think there was a little under 400 National Park Service sites. There were, I think, 59 of the ones we typically think of, that people think of as the iconic ones. And I told them my goal wasn't to go to as many as possible, to just go one a month, each one symbolizing a different issue for the future. So that was kind of the plan.
Yeah. So that was your original vision. So how did it change with your mom's diagnosis?
Right. So I had kind of a rough draft in my head of what these 12 parks would be. And then in February of that year, I started the year in January in Acadia National Park, because Cadillac Mountain in Acadia is the spot where first sunrise in America, well, in the continental United States. So I like the symbolism of that, starting with the sunrise atop Cadillac Mountain. Although having lived in Florida now for 30 some years, Maine on January 1st, it's a little chilly. I grew up in Wisconsin, but it was pretty cold atop Cadillac. I mean, it can be cold there in the summer if anybody's been there for sunrise.
Yeah, I went in the middle of the summer and the wind was just whipping.
Right.
And we did not stay nearly as long as we had hoped to originally.
Yeah, I went back there this summer in June, and it was chilly. So that's where I started the year. And then I think maybe partly to thaw out, February, my park I'd picked was Saguaro National Park. Partly in Tucson, Arizona, I wanted to write about the cacti there, that, there's only a handful of parks that are named after their vegetation. I was trying to think what ones. It would be Redwood, Joshua Tree, Saguaro, Sequoia. That might be it. There's probably something for you. But anyway, I wanted one park to think about the vegetation, and the saguaro cactus is when you think of the West, that's kind of what you think of, but it's really just one piece of the West. But the other reason I went there, coming back to your question, was that's where my mom, after my dad passed away, that's where my mom moved, was Tucson. She loved Saguaro National Park, and she made us, and I have two sisters and all her grandchildren, we all fell in love with Saguaro National Park because of her. So that I wanted to include that as one of the parks. And I went there in February, And I always remember it was February 7th. And I had met with the superintendent of the park there and called my mom. And she had met with a doctor that day. And my mom was about as healthy a 70-year-old as I knew. She hiked many miles every day and we always wore us out on vacation. But she said, yeah, the doctor says I have an inoperable cancer and I'm dying, which, that was completely out of the blue for me. And so at least initially it felt like, well, this assignment or whatever I want to look at, this project is kind of becomes meaningless. Like, why am I doing this? Why am I going to travel to national parks? But pretty quickly, it became more meaningful to me, because the reason I love the national parks because my mom and dad took me to them when we were little kids. And I think that's often the case, is they get passed down from generation to generation, both in that micro family way, but also in a macro way. That's how we pass down these places as a country from one generation to the next. So, and my mom said right away, no, I want you to stick. She was very proud of this. All those other things I'd done, I think she was mildly proud of, but Super Bowl, whatever. But she was excited and very. She volunteered at Swarrow, and when I'd stop in the visitor center there, they had all heard about my project from my mom. So I kind of pretty much stuck with my plan, but also tweaked it to make it a little more in the Southwest in some of those early months, like in March and April. March, I was at Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, and then April was Grand Canyon. That was partly to kind of think about the Colorado River and think about the future of water in the West, which was a big issue then, and it feels like in the last decade, there's been so many stories about that. It continues to be even a bigger issue, and I think obviously will be another 100 years from now. It will be a huge issue. So yeah, so my mom became, and just grieving in general, I think how you grieve became a thread in the book that certainly was not planned, but
Right.
yeah.
Right. Well, so we asked the audience who's been to a national park, and I think almost everybody raised their hands, and that is always wonderful to see. And one of the questions that we always get working in the Park Service is, what is your favorite park?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I told you, I don't like that question.
I want to hear your answer. I want to hear Barbara's answer first now.
Well, it was easiest to answer it when I was working, because then it was always whatever park I was working in at the time was my favorite, because how could I say anything other than that? But my real answer is that I don't have one favorite, because each park really is unique in some aspect of it. It might be the natural resource itself, the cultural resource, the stories, the history, whether it's in the north or the south or the mountains or the beach. There's just something different and unique at every park. And so I really cannot pick just one. What about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't pick one. And it is I just got back from Sequoia Kings Canyon, and I feel like right now that might be my favorite. It's so beautiful. In the back country, there's as beautiful a place as I've seen anywhere in the world. But typically what I answer is, because I knew I needed to come up with an answer for this, so I still wouldn't pick one, but I would usually say, like, I think maybe Redwood and maybe Grand Canyon. And Redwood is that's the first chapter of the book. It's my earliest memories are Redwood, when I was about, I think, 7, 8 years old. And I took my daughter back there when she was 7 or 8. And Grand Canyon, I went there when I was young, and have gone back repeatedly with family, with friends. And I think that's one of the pieces of the equation is it's not just when I ask people what's their favorite, it's not just what is the most beautiful one. It's kind of often, well, I love this. It's beautiful. I went there with, so it's the very personal memories that are tied to that place. And I think that makes sense. And yeah, and then so beyond that, so that I think the personal connection to those that I keep going back to Grand Canyon, although in the last decade I've gone back to Yosemite. I went 40 years without going to Yosemite before the book, and I think I've been back 5 times in the last decade. So I've gone back again and again. So that's up there. But Grand Canyon and Redwood, I realize they feel so different, you know, giant trees, coastal, kind of arid desert. But then it hit me, there are 2 things that are very similar about going to those parks is that they make you feel incredibly small. The trees, you look at them, you're like these, you know, the tallest living things on earth, and they're 2,000 years old. I always think about that like, okay, America was born and this tree was already very old. It's been standing like this long before any national park, long before our nation. And then you go to the Grand Canyon, and the layers of the rock are like a timeline of, and I think, what is it at the bottom layer, this black dark rock is the Vishnu is 1.7 billion, I think they estimate. So and it's, you know, it's a mile across, and or I mean not it's a mile deep, 10 miles across. So both of those places, you're standing there, and both the time and your size, you feel really, really tiny. And I always find that kind of oddly comforting. Like you know, all these things I've been worrying about aren't that important. And, you know, I'm just a
in the
speck.
scope of
Yeah.
the world. And
I'm just a
and
speck in
life.
time and a speck in, and I can kind of let go of some of those things standing there and just appreciate that place. So those 2, yeah, you talk about places to kind of calm yourself and think about. I think about standing in Stout Grove in the Redwoods, or standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, or be even better, being down at the bottom. There's something spiritual about that.
Yeah. Well, as you talk about those emotional connections, and that to me is one of the greatest values of our national parks, because they really are examples of the universal values. It doesn't really matter where you grew up, or your religion, or your political affinity, any of those things. There are some basic universal principles. And I think when you say it makes you feel small, I think most everybody gets that immediately. That's one of those universal values that we understand the emotion of that. And our national parks are places where you can find those common values, different but the same again and again. So it's really special.
Yeah, when I was working on the book, I think I put it in the epilogue that at the end, kind of like, you know, this is my story, my family's story, my childhood memories. And some ways it feels really self-centered to be, you know, pouring out however many 100 pages of those. But I think, and I hoped, and I thought it to be true, that a lot of people have very different memories in mind, but there's a lot of similarities that they can remember their childhood trips, or they, when we go to the Grand Canyon, we each have very unique personal experiences, but there's, in some ways, they're also very similar. And that, yeah, that is definitely some of the magic of these places. And that, and it also, you go back, you know, decades later, and yes, I'm you know, I'm well aware that all of them are being affected, are changing, climate change is changing them, but they feel very much the same as when I went there as a child, and I could take my daughter to the same spot I went, and it feels very, very similar. And I can't, I've said this before, I can't go to my hometown and do that. I have to go, this is what used to be over here, this is what used to be over there. But when I take her to Grand Canyon, I can kind of say, this is the view that, it's been like this for millions of years.
So I know you met a lot of interesting people. You talked about some of them in the book and had some impactful experiences there. What stands out for you in any of the parks that you visited, either interesting people or best experience or...
Yeah, it's kind of like favorite park. It's
Yeah.
almost impossible to pick. Yeah, that was one of the blessings of the year, was that when I won the fellowship, I knew I had this year off. I knew I'd get to go to parks. I don't think it hit me till later. It allowed me to, every place I went, I could contact the superintendent or contact the public information officer and kind of set up, go to Yellowstone, you have an expert on bison, go to, each of these different places I could go spend some time with the ranger or the superintendent. And often I just wanted people to, this place way better than I do. Why do you love it? Tell me about why you love this place. So those throughout the year, those were amazing. As far as favorites, most memorable, I don't know that I can pick one. I'll maybe give you, Flight 93. I picked because our national parks aren't just about natural history preservation. They're about telling history, telling America's history, good, bad, ugly. And I could have gone to a place like, I did go to like Little Bighorn, which I found fascinating, or I could have gone to Gettysburg or Antietam, but I wanted the historical park I chose was Flight 93 National Memorial and near Shanksville, partly because all those other parks tell the story of something that happened long before us. Mm-hmm. That's telling the story of something that we all remember, but my daughter doesn't remember. 100 years from now, nobody will remember. So how do you tell that story, which is a very interesting challenge for the Park Service? Like, how do you create a place to tell that story? So the rangers there were really interesting, that very passionate about that. So interesting rangers. But beyond that, the other reason I chose that was a woman, Lori Guadagno, who lives out at the beach. Her brother Richard was one of the passengers on Flight 93. And I had gone there for the 5th anniversary for the paper to write about the 5th anniversary. And Richard was a ranger, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Ranger. So which is separate from the Park Service, but it falls under the Department of Interior umbrella. So he was the only Department of Interior employee on that plane, a ranger. And so when I won this, I told Lori, I want to tell Richard's story. I want to tell people about him, tell people about Flight 93. So I went with Lori and her family that year, and I've gone back there 3 or 4 times. I was there last year. Was it was a big, or a couple of years ago, 20th anniversary. So I went back for that. And yeah, it's always a pretty emotional, impactful place. But that kind of played, that and other places, whether intentionally or unintentionally, played into grieving. I'm losing my mom. I told Lori, here I'm losing my mom this year. That's hard. It was way harder than I thought it would be, because I'm grown up, I'm independent. I didn't think it would hit me as hard as it did, but at least I got to say goodbye to her. Lori never got to say goodbye to Richard, and none of the passengers did. So that place and some of the people I met there, because of Lori, I go to places that only family members were supposed to go, but she said, "Your family." So I met a lot of other Flight 93 families and went to dinners with them and sat with them. There was one year I sat with all the families, and afterwards I forget which dignitary was there. It was, whether, I think it might have been the vice president or there's been presidents there, but they went back behind to greet the family members, and I stayed seated because I said, I don't feel right. But then I realized, oh wait, the crowd's all here. I'm seated by myself. I probably look like I'm protesting whoever's back there, and that wasn't it. I just wanted to say, I'm not a family member. But so since then, I have, because of that, I've gone back there and met presidents and vice presidents with Lori because of that. So
Wow, that's really special.
yeah.
Yeah. So going back to your first thoughts about what this book would be, what this year would be about, what are some of the challenges facing our parks now that you learned about or discovered or are still thinking about?
I feel like that should be the question for you. She'd be the expert on this, but yeah, I mean, I think I picked your brain on that definitely beforehand. I always say kind of one of my epiphanies, some of the stuff I knew going in advance, like I'm going to, I wanted to write about climate change. I thought about going to Glacier, but I'd read a lot of stories about the glaciers receding that just didn't excite me, other than going to those mountains excited me.
Mhm.
But I instead wrote about dry tortugas and how the water's coming up, on the fort there, and that, think about what it's going to be in 20, 30, 100 years. But those weren't necessarily surprises. I kind of expected. The one that I think was kind of an epiphany was, and in hindsight, it probably shouldn't have been, was kind of the biggest threat to the parks is us, and not the old loving the parks to death. I was able to go up to DC and meet with the director of the Park Service at the time, Jonathan Jarvis, and he was the one who kind of said this: we can manage people, we can figure that out. So I'm not really worried about loving our parks to death, and I don't even like that phrase. He wants people visiting the parks. And he said, and what struck me throughout the year was that it's more, are we loving them enough? And, all of you have been to parks, you probably do. But if the American people don't love them enough, they're not preserved forever. I think before that year, I thought, oh, we create a national park, either, through a national monument, through presidential pen, or act of Congress for a national park, and they're forever safe and preserved. And that's not true. I mean, we can chip away at that, and we won't if the American people love their parks and we say, no, these are important. But if that ever changes, so I feel like I met with the superintendent at Grand Canyon, and he said had maybe been there a year, was relatively new, and said, I've basically been handed the keys to one of the most protected places on earth. What do you think I do every day? I said, I don't know. He said, try to protect it. And he basically talked about how there were, the overflights, airspace was an issue. The water running through the canyon was an issue. Development nearby was an issue. There was plans to have this gondola going. Basically, it was kind of under attack from all kind of fronts, and he's trying to fight that off and protect that place. It's one of the most protected places on earth. So I sometimes think about, and that's true of the Grand Canyon, but it's true of probably all 400 some National Park Service sites.
Yeah. And, through my international work, I have discovered that we are very lucky in this country that our citizens do love our parks and do care about our parks. And our government hears from our citizens if they don't like some decisions that are being made about the parks, and the citizens are indeed protecting our parks. And in many of the other countries that I go to, the citizens don't have that relationship
Hmm.
yet.
Hmm.
They haven't built that generational love for parks.
Hmm.
And that is a big part of what we try and introduce, that concept of the citizens are your best weapon, your best protection. And many of the parks, many of the countries, protection of the natural resource is what their parks are about.
Mhm.
And they have very strict rules, and some places like our wilderness, some places that they don't even allow people in.
Mhm.
And so that's one of the things that we like to share is how valuable to our national parks and our resources the public is
Yeah.
in that regard. And
Right.
so,
Yeah, when
yeah.
I have a slideshow that I do sometimes, and I have a picture from Dry Tortugas. There's like a log book where you can sign in, and it had a at the bottom of it said in French, "Les paradise." It was paradise on earth. I had to look up the translation, and it was somebody from Bordeaux, France. And I thought, here's this place that we think of, traveling to, the exotic, and um, that was something that struck me again and again. Like I just got back from hiking on the John Muir Trail, and there was a lot of hikers from Japan, a lot from Germany, a lot from basically all over the world, and that is something they will say is, and I think I put this in the book. They'll ask you, do Americans realize what you have here, and they'd say, like, if it's a competition with castles or churches or whatever, cathedrals, we think we can whip you in that, because we're so far ahead of you. Your stuff, you get excited about a 200-year-old church, and all our churches are 200 years old, kind of thing. But they said we do not have place. I remember when I was in Haleakala, somebody had said that to me. We don't have a place like this. And that's what they said. Do Americans realize what they have? And I think, and my response always was, I think many Americans do, but my fear is that that's not a given. And yeah, that the centennial year, the Park Service visitation was through the roof. They were hoping it would be big, and they thought that was going to be the spike, and then COVID hit, and another spike. So that in the last decade or so, it's gotten so, management of people has become an even bigger issue. That Yosemite started having caps on quota per day visitors, and a lot of parks have had to go to that just because they have gotten so crowded, which is, I try and remind myself that's a good problem to have, that people really want to get to these places.
Yes, and I believe that the putting of caps, either numbers of people a day, or we first saw it in number of backcountry permits given at a time.
Mm-hmm.
The recognition that passing a few other people on the trail does not hurt your experience, but passing and being passed by people on the trail with no break, it then
Changes it.
It totally does. And people will say, I'll never do that again if that's the experience that they have. There's a certain expectation when you go out into our parks that you will have an opportunity to commune with nature a little bit. And if there's people everywhere, then you can't have that experience. And we do value that experience. So it is a very fine balance of making sure that the parks are accessible to everyone, because the parks belong to all of us, but also that we protect the experience as well.
Yeah.
So, and I want to say that I kind of ruined our experience a little here with my telephone, and I am so sorry about that. It's turned off now. Uh, so, Mark, tell us about your writing process. I know that's a standard question in these kinds of chats, but how do you go about writing a
Well,
book?
this was all new for me because I had never written a book. You know, I was used to, okay, I come up with a column idea on Monday and write it, and it's in the paper a couple days later, and present it to an editor and do some reporting and finish it off and move on to the next one again and again. And so this was completely different all of a sudden, not to have anything due immediately and to go more extensive in the reporting process for each of these. And my plan was that I would, the 12 months, 12 parks, I would go each place for maybe a couple weeks, come home, transcribe all my interviews, sit down and write for a week, and then go to the next one. At the end of 12 months, I'd have 12 chapters written. The year ended, and I think I had one chapter written. And that was partly losing my mom, changed a lot of things that year, but it was also probably just as much that I overestimated what I was going to get done. And yeah, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I had the Dry Tortugas chapter written the 5th, that was May, but nothing else. And so I went back to work, January 1 the next year, and didn't really have that much written, and thought, okay, I'll work on nights and weekends. I'm a horribly slow writer, so I wasn't making much progress. And then in the couple years later, I realized, the window, the hook for this really is the centennial. So I think it was 2014. I went to my bosses and said, can I take an unpaid, another sabbatical? This time, both of them were unpaid, but I had the fellowship for this first one. The second one was just, I'm not getting a salary. I'm just, so I did that and spent that year writing. That just made that my job. I would just sit and write. But that year ended, and I was about 3/4 of the way through, and I still didn't have anybody interested in publishing it. So we got deep into 2015. I don't know if how many of you listen to NPR. Steve Inskeep, the host. Yeah, Steve Inskeep wrote a book, Jackson Land. And so I did a column on that and interviewed him, a phone interview, and said, after the interview, can I ask you just a question aside? And said, sure. And I explained this project, and he said, oh, that sounds like a great book. And I said, well, I think so, but haven't got anywhere. Any tips? And he said, well, here's the email address for my agent. She may have no interest, but at least, it'll get you directly to her. So, and everybody had told me that was the key. You can't just contact a publisher. This was all new to me. You need an agent. So I'd emailed agents, no success. So I emailed his agent. She said, that sounds very worthwhile. It was like a one sentence. I thought, okay. She said, send me a chapter. So I sent her one, didn't hear for a week. I thought she had no interest. And then she sent me back, do you have more? Send me a couple more. And then another week, she said, send me everything you got. So, and then that was, I think, October or something. It was September. She said, let's pitch this to publishers. And so she pitched it to publishers. And then I think in October of that year, 2015, I got the contract with St. Martin's Press. And I had to have a manuscript done by January 3rd of 2016. So they could get it out by the summer of 2016. And so I went from feeling like no progress to 0 to 60 to having and I just wrote, finished it off. And, I'd never counted the words, and I'd written 150,000 words, and the book contract called for 75,000 words. So
Wow.
I asked the editor, can I send them 150,000 words? She said, absolutely not. So I cut 120, and can I send them that? No, absolutely not. So I cut it to 99,998. I always remember that. I looked under it. She said, okay. And then when I sent it to the editor, she said, this is good. And we like the length's fine. I was like, that was the best email. I'm done cutting. But that was among the hardest part, was cutting 50,000 words out of it. So
I can imagine after you poured your heart into it, then to cut some out,
Yeah.
that would
yeah,
be
so that was a
difficult.
different kind of writing process. My long answer to my 150,000 word answer to your question.
So I know that you still love visiting national parks. What's on your list for where are you going next?
Well, like I said, I just got back from Sequoia Kings Canyon and the John Muir
Mhm.
Trail, and tomorrow I'm flying to Canyon de Chelly in northern Arizona. There's a run that I've wanted to do there for 10 years, and only 150 people get into it, and I finally got into it. So
great.
I'm doing that this on Friday. It's normally would be Saturday, but because of the solar eclipse is considered like almost sacred to them, they do not do anything on Saturday as a solar eclipse, so they moved the race to Friday. So I think I'll get this Canyon de Chelly, you can only go into the canyon. It's Navajo run. It's one of the I think maybe the only national park that has that. And you can only go in the canyon if you have tribal people with you, except on this one day for the race. So I think it's going to be hopefully very memorable.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, well, let's wrap up our part here with how you wrapped up your book at Haleakala, and tell us what your experience was there.
Well, I'll just slightly interrupt and do our
Okay,
call for
sure.
audience questions, and maybe you can answer it if somebody included in theirs.
Sure.
But thank you to Barbara and to Mark for such a wonderful interview. But we are going to open it up to audience questions. I know quite a few of you got them to me already, so I have a good stack to give to Barbara. So if you have any questions that pop up, please do write them down. I and a volunteer will be walking around and collecting them throughout. So you're still good to submit. And for our Zoom audience, if you have any questions, do write them in the Q&A box and we'll get them to Barbara as well. But here we go.
All right. Okay. When you are out in nature, how do you keep track of your ideas?
I mean, in this, I used, at least for this project, I used a recorder almost constantly. So like I'd go for a hike with a ranger. I'd say instead of sitting with a ranger, I just want to, let's not just sit in your office and do an interview. Take me on this trail and tell me about what we're seeing. But I wouldn't try and sit there and scribble down notes, thank goodness, because my handwriting is bad enough I couldn't read it 5 minutes later, let alone when I'm writing 2 years later. So I had, I don't know, probably 100 hours of audio, which was such a chore to transcribe. But it also, I think, saved me that I could go back, hear exactly what somebody told me, but it also put me in that moment listening to it again, like, oh, I remember it sounded like this. And so in that case, I recorded everything pretty, and photojournalism was my major. So I kind of get a little crazy taking pictures always, and that. So between the audio and the photo, and then of course some old-fashioned scribbling, but that saved me, having the visuals and the audio to kind of take me back to wherever I was.
Smart. What's more challenging, writing a book or your column?
That's a good one, because when I was writing the book, I was kind of like, oh, I kind of missed this is so daunting. I missed the kind of just the small bites and more daily stuff. Now that I'm back to doing this, I'm like, oh, wish I didn't have this deadline tomorrow and I could focus on something longer. They're so different. I don't know. Right now, I would say when I finished the book, I thought that's the hardest thing I've ever done. Right now, I'm like, oh, I wish I could just immerse myself.
Do it again.
Yeah.
So. Were there other books about nature or memoirs that you took inspiration from while writing your book?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was some of the fun of this, was all of those 12 parks, I would try and find what had been written about them and those places. So I'd get good sense of the history. You know, it sparked some ideas. Yeah, I'm trying to think of any one example. Well, like before I went to Yosemite, if you saw the Ken Burns series, you may have seen Shelton Johnson was a ranger in there that kind of stole some of the scenes. He was such a good storyteller. And Shelton wrote a book called Glory Land about the Buffalo Soldiers, the African American soldiers who protected Yosemite in its early years. And so that kind of helped me, things like that helped me tap in the history. And some of it, you know, I just wanted to go and experience a place, but I also kind of wanted a lot of a certain amount of knowledge going in. Yeah, that was it was really fun to have I probably read more that year than I do now. I think I had more time to read, and I had a purpose for the reading.
Yeah. So someone has asked, please talk about the way to get the best Cumberland experience. What do you think?
I mean, if you're, you know, I know camping isn't for everyone, and I tried to camp during this. I camped a lot as a kid and then stopped doing it, and then during this year resumed doing it. And since then I've been camping, backpacking. It was partly to stretch money during that year, but it was also I wanted to experience the parks in a way that I think you don't if you're not sleeping under the stars and you're not. With Cumberland, if you're up for camping, you know, it's an amazing place to camp. It's really fun. You're out there, and the campground, Sea Camp, the main camp is very nice campground, but there's also wilderness sites farther north. So I would recommend that. If you're not up for camping, you can afford it. Grayfield Inn, is I have not stayed there. I have toured it when I was writing about some of the descendants. I've been out there and toured that. Thought about doing that on one of our anniversaries, but my wife and I end up camping out there. So it's a fun place to, you know, if you camp there, you can wander out to the beach at night, and the night skies are amazing because there's not much light pollution. So I highly recommend it. It's like a lot of places, you have to plan far in advance because campgrounds fill up. Yeah.
So speaking of night skies, that was a question I had to ask you about, but we were running out of time. But here's someone from the audience has asked about your favorite night sky park or experience.
Yeah, that's some of my childhood memories. That's the strongest thing. Like, and I remember being a kid in the Redwoods, you know, walking back from a ranger talk, looking at the night skies, things you kind of forget about when we live in a city. And, you know, it's not that the stars have disappeared. They're still there. It's just the light pollution changes everything. But you're reminded of that when you get out in some of these places. And the Park Service has a whole night skies division that, you know, you think, what? They're trying to preserve. But you realize it's one of those things, like a lot of things take, you know, air pollution or water pollution takes these grand measures. Light pollution, you can reduce instantly. And like Acadia has embraced that and got all the towns into it, and they have night skies festivals. So that's one that's memorable. But kind of, you started to ask about where I finished the year. Haleakala is this, you know, I started the year with the sunrise in Acadia, finished it with Haleakala in Maui. It has some of the best night skies anywhere because, you know, a couple thousand miles from other places, and you're in the middle of a crater. So even though there's towns below and lights below, you're blocked from that. And the night skies there, I camped in the crater the final night of the year, December 31st or December 30th, woke up December 31st. Those night skies were probably unlike anything I'd ever seen. It just felt like the stars kept like popcorn, pop, pop, pop. Like how many stars can fill the sky? So that was probably the most memorable night skies.
That's pretty fantastic. Okay, this one I think I can read. Do you think there will be a trend toward more regulated control of visitor traffic inside parks with buses instead of independent visitor movement.
Yeah, Barbara could probably answer this better than I can, but that's definitely a trend you see in Acadia, Zion, Grand Canyon has long had a shuttle system. But more and more, I think it's, try and improve the visitor experience, not to have traffic jams in the middle of the park. I think some of it's trying to think in terms of climate change, but it's, yeah, and they've gotten places where it works pretty effectively. And I think people at first are, resistant, like, no, I want my car, but then they realize how, if you make those function well and have them running constantly and have all kinds of different stops, that it actually can be a pretty good visitor experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think as Americans, we're pretty independent and we want to be in control, but really you get on those buses and you don't have to fight all the other cars. You don't have to find a parking spot. It can relieve a lot of the stress.
Yeah.
So let's see here. Some of these have some similarities. In light of the pandemic, forced rediscovery of camping and outdoor activities, how do you see your next contribution to the parks? Podcasts, serialized park profiles. What else might you do?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I've tried to, continue to write about our local parks, both, not just our national park. As mentioned in the intro, we have a really unique partnership that Barbara really helped create with our, the Timucuan Preserve is, involves state, local, federal parks, and it's, a wonderful collection, which, I start the year in Redwood National Park, and it's the official name is Redwood National and State Parks, or state and national parks. It's the campgrounds there are all state parks, but so they've made that work really nicely, and we make it work really nicely here. So anyway, I guess I tried to write about our local stuff, but I guess I need to pick Barbara's brain, find excuses to explore our national parks in different ways.
Well, while I was working at Timucuan, your articles were always very helpful for us in helping the Park Service, our local parks, to connect with the people in Jacksonville. When I first got here back in 1997, and we'd sit in a room like this and ask, how many people have been to the Timucuan Preserve, and we might get one hand raised. It's not that way 30 years later,
Right.
So that's a service that your column does by, reaching people that might not be going to the parks.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's one. Did your family travel with you that year, and what was that experience like for them? Did your mom live to hear of your experiences?
So yeah, that's both good questions. So the first one, they did not travel. Most of it was by myself. My wife was working full time. My daughter was in school. So, and I also didn't just hop in a van and head off for a year, because I didn't want to just leave them for the year. So what I would do is go a week or two and come back, and I'd take my daughter to school the whole time, when I was home, and very, try and be involved if possible. But yeah, no, we couldn't. I think if, it was tempting to like try and figure out a way to just disappear for the whole year as a family. But that just wasn't doable. So then they did like, the main one they came on was Yellowstone in the middle of summer, because it was school. It was June. And my daughter, and she had some of her cousins there. So we kind of had a big family trip. They became junior rangers, all that. it was kind of funny. I was just telling somebody this story the other day. My daughter had an old fashioned camera. She was down to like 2 pictures, and there was a geyser or bison poop, and she had to pick which one to take a picture of. And she was in an age where she took a picture of the bison poop. So that was, but she, that month was also, so that was memorable because that was a family trip. But yeah, while I was there, my family flew back to Jacksonville. I stayed a little bit longer to interview rangers and do some of the more journalistic stuff. And I was going to fly back to Jacksonville, and I'd called my sister in Tucson. My mom was diagnosed in February, and she had really deteriorated in May and June. And my sister said, I think you better come to Tucson. So I changed my plane ticket and flew from Yellowstone to Tucson. And yeah, my mom died June 30th of that year, which, I always thought feels kind of symbolic. Like that's the exact midpoint of the year. It's 6 months before, 6 months after. And to me, that's what that year kind of was about. Was the first half was kind of, how do you deal with losing a loved one? Second half was, after you've lost somebody, how do you kind of regroup and get on with your own life? And both of those were, extremely challenging. And for me, everybody handles that differently. For me, both nature and the national parks were key pieces of that. That so many of these places I go, I either went there with my mom and dad, or even if I didn't, I think there was only 1 or 2 where they had not been. So I knew they had been there at some point in their life. So even if I hadn't been there, I don't think my mom ever made it to Haleakala. So not the finishing point. But that, when you started to ask the question, I was going to tell you what led to when I had the 12 months planned out, the one I did not have figured out was the last one. I didn't know where I would go. But at some point somebody said, well, you started with a sunrise in Acadia. Are you going to finish with a sunset in Hawaii? And I kind of laughed, and I thought about it. Well, I'm creating this itinerary. I could. And I started looking at Hawaiian national parks and thought about Hawaii volcanoes, the kind of the symbolism of literal new land being created. And then I looked at Haleakala, and it became a national park like the week I was born. And I'm the first of 3 children. So the week my parents became parents, it had all these elements of the other national parks that felt like they were being pulled together. Some of the darkest night skies, one of the quietest places on earth, a lot of endangered species, all this indigenous history. And then I read the mythology of it, which is that the story behind it is that the little boy Maui, this little demigod Maui, said that his mother said she didn't have enough time to get all her chores done. So one night Maui crept up to the edge of the crater, and when the sun came over, lassoed the sun and pulled it down. And he said, I'll let you go, but you have to promise to slow down when you pass over this part of the world. So the sun agreed. So the local legend is that the sun slows down as it passes over Haleakala. So I heard this story. Okay, a boy lassoing the sun for his mom. The day slowing down. As much as I love my job, I kind of didn't want this year to end. And I thought, okay, I think I'm going I meant to finish the year in Haleakala. And that became, the title of the book was Lassoing the Sun. So that's, people never know what it means till hopefully they make it to the last chapter and it makes sense. So.
Well, I think we need to end on that. That was just perfect. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.